There's a specific kind of person that makes everyone around them slightly uncomfortable in the best possible way. They finish things, consistently, without the dramatic last-minute scrambles most people consider normal. They never seem rushed, even when a quick look at their actual schedule shows it's objectively packed with more than most people would consider manageable. They respond to requests quickly without seeming stressed about it, and they somehow never appear to be the person quietly drowning that everyone else assumes they must secretly be. And when you finally ask them how they manage all of it, they usually shrug, genuinely unsure what to say, because to them, none of it feels like discipline in any effortful sense. It feels like the default setting their entire life simply runs on, without requiring daily willpower to maintain. That's not a personality type, and it was never some innate trait they were lucky enough to be born with while everyone else missed out. It's an engineered outcome, built from a small number of specific, identifiable mechanisms that almost nobody ever explains clearly, largely because most productivity content is built to sell inspiration and motivation rather than actual mechanism, since inspiration is easier to package and sell repeatedly than a genuine working system that only needs to be taught once. Today I'm giving you the actual mechanism, 5 layers, each one backed by real, published, peer-reviewed research, rather than vague motivational language borrowed from a stock inspirational quote, that together produce what I'm calling dangerously organized, a level of consistent execution that looks, from the outside, almost unfair compared to everyone else still fighting the exact same friction you're about to systematically eliminate, one layer at a time. This is a complete plan, not a single isolated trick you'll forget about within a week. 5 layers that stack directly on top of each other in a specific and deliberate order, starting with the one that costs you the most invisible energy every single day without you ever consciously noticing it's even happening in the background. If frameworks with real, cited research behind them consistently help you operate differently rather than just feel briefly inspired, subscribe now, because the algorithm buries content like this unless people actively tell it they want more of it. And leave a like right now if you've ever ended a genuinely busy day feeling completely drained despite not being able to point to anything specific that drained you, because that exact familiar feeling is precisely what Layer 1 exists to eliminate at its actual, identifiable source. Layer 1 is attention residue, and once you understand it, you'll never look at your own scattered day the same way again. In 2009, organizational psychologist Sophie Leroy, then at the University of Washington, published research that identified something almost nobody had properly named before, despite virtually everyone experiencing it constantly, every single day, without ever tracing it to its actual source. When you switch from one task to a completely different one, especially when the first task was left incomplete, unfinished, or interrupted under time pressure, part of your attention doesn't actually make the switch with you. It stays behind, cognitively attached to the task you just left, quietly consuming working memory and executive function that you now need for the new task in front of you. Leroy called this attention residue, and her research showed that people who switched tasks this way performed measurably worse on the second task than people who had genuinely completed or properly closed out the first one before moving on to something new. The mechanism behind why this happens is worth understanding precisely, because it explains why the fix isn't simply willpower or better focus. Leroy's own explanation, later expanded in her work published through Harvard Business Review, points to what she describes as a fundamental need for completion built into how attention works. The brain resists abandoning an unresolved task the same way it resists leaving a sentence unfinished mid-thought. This isn't a character flaw or a discipline problem, it's a structural feature of how attention allocates itself, and it means that simply deciding to focus harder on the new task does almost nothing to resolve it, because the residue isn't a matter of insufficient effort. It's a matter of an unmet, mostly unconscious need for closure on the task you already left behind. Here's why this matters more than almost anything else in this video. Most people's days are built entirely out of incomplete switches, one after another, hour after hour. A message half answered before a meeting starts and interrupts it. A document half reviewed before a call arrives and pulls attention elsewhere. A thought half finished before a notification lands and redirects everything. None of these switches are clean. Every single one of them leaves residue behind, and that residue accumulates across a normal day into something that explains a feeling almost everyone has experienced and almost nobody can properly name. Total exhaustion at the end of a day where, on paper, looking back at an actual list of what got done, you didn't do all that much. You weren't tired from the work itself. You were tired from carrying dozens of unfinished cognitive threads simultaneously throughout the day, each one quietly draining capacity you needed for whatever you were supposedly focused on at any given moment, none of them ever properly closed. Research from Gloria Mark, a separate researcher studying digital interruption, adds a specific and sobering number to this picture. The average knowledge worker takes roughly 25 minutes to fully return to a task after being interrupted from it. Not 25 minutes to notice the interruption is over. 25 minutes before attention has genuinely returned to its full prior depth on the original task. Multiply that cost across the dozen or more interruptions a typical modern workday contains, and the accumulated residue explains far more of your daily exhaustion than the actual difficulty of the work itself ever does. The person who seems dangerously organized isn't working with more raw energy than you have available. They're leaking almost none of it through unclosed switches throughout the day. The mechanism for this is what Leroy's own follow-up research points toward directly: deliberate task closure before switching to anything else. Before you move from one task to a genuinely different one, you spend 10 to 20 seconds doing something concrete, writing down exactly where you left off and what the very next step will be when you eventually return to it. This sounds almost too small to matter, and that perceived smallness is precisely why almost nobody actually does it consistently. But the mechanism at work is specific and well documented. The brain's attention lingers on unfinished tasks because of that unresolved need for completion described above. Writing down the exact next step doesn't complete the original task in any real sense, but it satisfies enough of that underlying need for closure that the residue drops sharply and measurably, freeing up the working memory capacity that would otherwise have stayed silently attached to whatever you just left behind, unresolved, for the rest of the day. The practical version of Layer 1 is this: before every genuine task switch today, and for the rest of this week, write exactly one sentence: where I'm stopping and what the specific next step is when I return to this. Not a full plan, not a paragraph. One sentence, every single time you switch to something meaningfully different. This alone, done consistently across a full week, recovers a meaningful percentage of the cognitive capacity most people are silently losing every single day of their working lives, without ever once tracing the exhaustion back to its actual, identifiable cause. Here's what this looks like concretely, in an ordinary day, rather than as an abstract instruction. You're halfway through drafting an email when a colleague messages you with an urgent question. Instead of switching immediately, mid-sentence, you spend 8 seconds writing, "Draft is at paragraph 2. Next step is finishing the point about the deadline extension." Then you switch, fully, to the colleague's question. When you eventually return to the email, that single sentence does something specific. It lets you re-enter the task at full depth almost immediately, rather than spending the first several minutes back at the document simply trying to reconstruct where your thinking had been before the interruption pulled you away. Multiply this across every switch in an ordinary day, 5, 10, sometimes 20 separate interruptions, and the cumulative time and mental energy recovered is substantial, even though each individual instance of the practice takes less time than reading this sentence took you. The resistance most people feel toward this practice is worth naming honestly, because it's the same resistance that quietly kills most small interventions before they get a real chance to compound. It feels, in the specific moment of an interruption, like an unnecessary extra step slowing you down when you're already being pulled away against your will. This feeling is misleading. The 8 to 20 seconds spent writing the closure sentence is reliably smaller than the 25 minutes Gloria Mark's research shows it typically takes to return to full depth on an interrupted task without that closure step in place. The math overwhelmingly favors the small, immediate cost over the large, hidden one that most people are currently paying without ever noticing the transaction. Layer 2 is decision automation, and it explains why some people seem to have effortless self-control while spending almost no visible energy maintaining it day after day. Psychologist Roy Baumeister's research on what's commonly called ego depletion, while later debated and refined in some of its specific experimental claims by subsequent researchers, established a foundational and still widely supported idea in the broader field. Willpower and decision-making draw from a shared, genuinely limited pool of mental resources across a single day. Every decision you make, no matter how small it seems in isolation, from what to wear, to how to phrase an email, to whether to answer a text right now or wait, draws from that same shared pool. By the time you reach the decisions that actually carry real weight and real consequences later in the day, That pool has often already been meaningfully depleted by dozens or even hundreds of trivial decisions that never needed to be decisions at all in the first place. This is precisely why a specific, recurring pattern shows up repeatedly among people who manage extraordinarily demanding schedules across very different fields. Barack Obama, during his presidency, was widely reported to wear only gray or blue suits, explaining directly in interviews that he didn't want to spend any decision-making energy whatsoever on what to wear because he had far too many other decisions, many of them genuinely consequential, waiting for him every single day. The specific wardrobe detail itself isn't really the point of this example. The underlying mechanism is, every single trivial decision you eliminate from your day through a fixed, pre-committed default is decision-making capacity preserved and protected for something later that actually deserves the full weight of your attention. This pattern isn't limited to famous examples, and it isn't limited to clothing either. Once you start looking for it, the same underlying principle shows up in how many high-functioning people structure meals, structure their morning sequence, and structure recurring categories of correspondence, precisely because each fixed default is one less decision competing for a finite daily resource that's going to run thin, regardless of how disciplined a person believes themselves to be. The dangerously organized version of this isn't limited to clothing at all. It's a systematic, deliberate audit of your own day, looking specifically for repeated, low-stakes decisions currently being made fresh, from scratch, every single time they arise, and replacing each one at a time, with a fixed default that removes the decision entirely, rather than just making it faster. The same breakfast most days, chosen once and left alone rather than reconsidered every morning. A fixed time and a fixed format for a recurring category of task, rather than deciding fresh each time exactly how and when to approach it. A default response template for a common category of requests that arrives regularly so that responding doesn't require composing something new from a blank page every single time it appears in your inbox. None of these individually seem important enough to matter on their own. Collectively, applied consistently across a full week, they preserve a measurable, genuinely meaningful reserve of decision-making capacity for the small handful of choices each day that actually deserve your full cognitive resources, rather than those choices getting whatever depleted capacity happens to be left over by the middle of the afternoon. It's worth being honest about why this is harder to sustain than it sounds on first hearing it. Fixed defaults feel, at first, like a small loss of freedom or personality, a resistance most people feel the moment they consider wearing the same few outfits or eating the same breakfast repeatedly. That resistance is worth examining directly, because it's almost always driven by the mistaken belief that these trivial choices carry more personal meaning than they actually do, when in reality they're simply consuming a scarce resource for essentially no benefit in return. The practical version of Layer 2 is this. Identify 3 recurring low-stakes decisions you currently make fresh every single day, without exception, and replace each one with a fixed, pre-committed default starting this week. Not because the specific choice you land on matters much on its own merits, because removing the decision entirely, permanently, protects the shared resource pool for whatever actually deserves it later that same day, when the depletion would otherwise have already taken its toll. Concretely, this might look like the following across a single week. Monday, you decide once for the whole week what your breakfast will be, and you stop reconsidering it every morning, freeing roughly 30 seconds of decision-making each day that felt trivial in isolation but was never actually free. Tuesday, you decide once what time you check messages each day, morning, midday, and evening, rather than deciding fresh every single time a notification appears, whether now is the moment to look at it. Wednesday, you build 2 or 3 fixed response templates for the category of message you receive most often, so that responding becomes a matter of light editing rather than composing something new from a blank page every time. By the end of the week, none of these individual defaults feels dramatic on its own. Together, they represent dozens of decisions each day that no longer draw from the same limited pool that your genuinely important choices depend on. It's worth addressing directly why this feels harder than it sounds for many people, even once they understand the underlying research clearly. Fixed defaults can feel, at first, like a small erosion of personal identity or spontaneity, since choosing your breakfast or your outfit each morning can feel like a form of self-expression rather than a cost. The research doesn't ask you to eliminate every trivial choice from your life permanently. It asks you to notice which specific trivial choices are costing you real capacity without providing any real benefit in return, and to convert exactly those into fixed defaults, while leaving genuine sources of enjoyment or self-expression fully intact. The goal isn't austerity for its own sake. It's precision about where your limited daily resource is actually going. Before layer 3, I want to bring in something that connects directly to why the first two layers are so difficult to sustain even once you understand them clearly. Both attention residue management and decision automation require a specific kind of calm, consistent follow-through that's genuinely hard to access when your own mind is running loud, anxious, or reactive. You can write the one-sentence closure note, you can set the fixed defaults, and still find yourself abandoning both within a week if the underlying mental noise driving your day hasn't been addressed at all. The K.M.A method was built for exactly that layer underneath everything else in this video. 5 minutes a day for mental control and inner calm. I use it as the daily foundation beneath every system I talk about on this channel, because the two layers we've covered so far depend entirely on a level of composure that most people's default mental state simply doesn't have available without deliberate daily practice. Point your camera at the QR code on the screen right now, or find the link in the description. There are 3 more layers to go, and they build directly on the first 2. Layer 3 is systems over goals, and it's the distinction that separates people who improve consistently over years from people who improve dramatically for exactly 2 weeks before reverting completely back to where they started. A goal is a specific outcome you're aiming at, defined clearly enough that you'll know when you've reached it. A system is the repeatable process that reliably produces outcomes like that one, consistently, regardless of whether motivation happens to be running high or low on any particular given day. The problem with goal-only thinking, which is how almost everyone approaches self-improvement by default, without ever questioning the approach itself, is that a goal provides genuine motivation exactly until the moment it's achieved, or exactly until the moment it starts to feel too distant and unreachable to be motivating anymore, both of which reliably happen within a matter of weeks of starting almost any ambitious pursuit. A system doesn't carry this same expiration date built into it, because a system isn't measured or evaluated by whether you happen to feel motivated today. It's measured entirely by whether the actual process ran as designed, completely independent of feeling. This distinction explains a pattern that shows up constantly and predictably in failed New Year's resolutions, abandoned fitness plans, and half-finished financial overhauls. The goal itself, lose a specific amount of weight, save a specific amount of money, feels genuinely motivating on day 1, when the distance to the goal is largest and the emotional charge of a fresh start is highest. But as the weeks pass and the goal remains stubbornly distant, tracking the gap between where you are and where you want to be becomes an increasingly demoralizing daily or weekly ritual, precisely at the moment when consistency matters most for actually reaching it. The visible feedback loop turns against you exactly when you need it working in your favor. The dangerously organized version of this distinction is concrete and specific. For every goal you're currently chasing, you identify the exact, repeatable daily or weekly process that would produce that outcome as a natural byproduct of simply running it consistently, and you track adherence to the process itself rather than tracking distance from the goal. If the goal is a specific level of fitness, the system is a specific, repeatable weekly training schedule, and what you actually track day to day is a simple yes or no, did the scheduled session happen, not how far you currently remain from the eventual physical outcome you're working toward. If the goal is a specific financial target, the system is a specific, repeatable weekly review and allocation process, and what gets tracked each week is whether that review genuinely happened as scheduled, not the current account balance, which fluctuates for reasons frequently outside your direct control on any given week, regardless of how faithfully you ran the underlying process. This matters because tracking the goal directly creates a demotivating feedback loop precisely when you need motivation most urgently, during the long, unglamorous middle period where real progress is genuinely happening but remains largely invisible to the naked eye, week after week, without any dramatic visible milestone to mark it. Tracking the system instead creates a feedback loop that stays consistently positive as long as you're actually doing the underlying work, completely independent of how far the visible outcome still has left to travel. A checkmark for a completed session feels like a win regardless of your current weight. A checkmark for a completed financial review feels like a win regardless of this week's account balance. That steady, reliable stream of small wins is what carries most people through the exact stretch where goal-only tracking reliably causes abandonment. The practical version of layer 3 is this. Pick your single most important current goal, the one that matters most to you right now. Write down the specific, repeatable process that would produce that goal as a natural side effect of simply running it consistently over time. And this week, track only whether that process ran as scheduled, not the outcome itself. Not the distance remaining, the process, and nothing else. Here's a concrete version of what this looks like in practice. Say the goal is building a small side business to the point of its first paying customer. A goal most people track by anxiously refreshing an analytics dashboard or a bank account, watching for a number that refuses to move for weeks at a time despite genuine effort. The system underneath that goal might be something as specific as 45 minutes of focused work on the business every weekday morning before anything else gets touched. The tracking for the week isn't whether a customer appeared. It's a simple checkmark, 5 for 5, on whether the 45 minutes happened each of the 5 weekdays. Some weeks, the checkmarks will be perfect and the goal will still feel exactly as distant as it did the week before. That's expected, and it's precisely why tracking the process instead of the goal matters here. The checkmarks accumulate into evidence of genuine consistency regardless of the goal's current visible distance, and consistency, sustained long enough, is what eventually produces the outcome, usually well after the point where goal-only tracking would have already caused most people to quit from sheer discouragement. This reframe changes something subtle but important about how a bad week feels. Under goal-only tracking, a week where the outcome didn't move at all feels like failure, full stop, regardless of what actually happened during that week. Under system tracking, a week where the process ran perfectly but the outcome still hasn't moved feels entirely different. It feels like a system doing exactly what it's supposed to do, patiently, while the outcome takes the time it naturally needs. That reframe alone is often the difference between someone who quits in week 6 and someone who's still running the same system, quietly and consistently, a full year later. Layer 4 is single-point capture, and it addresses a specific kind of hidden disorganization that most people never properly identify because it doesn't visually resemble disorganization from the outside, the way an obviously messy desk or an overflowing inbox does. Most people's information and commitments live scattered across 5 or 6 different locations simultaneously, without them ever consciously deciding to scatter it that way. A note in their phone's default notes app, a separate reminder in a completely different app used for a different purpose. A mental note they're simply trusting themselves to remember without writing down anywhere. A sticky note stuck to the edge of a monitor. A half-remembered conversation they meant to write down somewhere and, in the moment, didn't. Each individual piece of scattered information feels entirely manageable in isolation, which is exactly why the pattern persists for years without anyone identifying it as a genuine problem. The scattering itself, not any single piece of information within it, is what creates the actual cost, because every one of those separate locations requires its own background mental tracking, a low-grade awareness that something important is stored there somewhere and needs eventual attention, multiplied across every single scattered location simultaneously, all day, every day. The dangerously organized version of this is brutally simple to describe and genuinely difficult to maintain with real discipline over time. Every single piece of incoming information, every task, every idea, every commitment someone makes to you or you make to yourself, goes into exactly one designated capture location, immediately, at the precise moment it arrives, with zero exceptions made for things that feel too small to bother routing through the system properly, or too urgent to spare the 10 seconds it takes to capture correctly. Not because the specific tool you choose matters much on its own merits. A plain paper notebook works exactly as well as the most sophisticated app for this specific purpose, and in some documented cases works considerably better, because the friction of a physical notebook makes the capture itself feel more deliberate. The location matters entirely because of its singularity, not its features. When there's only one place anything could possibly be, the search cost and the background tracking cost both drop to nearly zero simultaneously, the same underlying mechanism a library's numbered catalog system relies on to make retrieval effectively instant, regardless of how enormous the overall collection grows over time. The discipline required here is almost entirely about resisting exceptions, because exceptions are exactly how every scattered system begins scattering again after a genuine attempt at consolidation. The urgent thought that arrives while you're in the shower and gets typed into whatever app happens to be open on your phone instead of the designated capture location. The commitment made verbally in a hallway conversation that gets mentally filed as something you'll definitely remember instead of written down anywhere at all. Each individual exception feels completely justified in the specific moment it happens, which is precisely the trap. Justified exceptions, repeated often enough across a normal week, are indistinguishable in their cumulative effect from never having built a single-point system in the first place. The practical version of Layer 4 is this. Pick exactly one capture location, a single physical notebook or a single specific app, starting today, and route absolutely everything through it for one full week without a single exception, including the small things that feel silly to write down formally and the urgent things that feel too important in the moment to delay even the 10 seconds it takes to capture them properly first. The discipline isn't really located in the tool you choose. It's located entirely in the zero exception rule, because one single exception made for something that felt too urgent to route properly through the system is exactly how every previously scattered system starts quietly scattering itself all over again within a matter of days. Here's what breaking this rule typically looks like, so you can recognize it in yourself before it happens rather than only after the fact. You're in a meeting and someone mentions a deadline you need to remember. Writing it in your designated capture location feels slightly awkward in the moment, so instead you tell yourself you'll definitely remember it, or you jot it on whatever piece of paper happens to be closest, a sticky note, the back of an envelope, a random new note in whatever app happened to be open on your phone at that exact second. 3 days later, when the deadline actually matters, that information is sitting somewhere you're not currently looking, and the 10 seconds you saved by not routing it properly has now cost you considerably more time searching, or worse, has simply been lost entirely. The rule exists precisely for this scenario, the one that always feels like the reasonable exception in the moment, and never feels that way in hindsight once something important has actually gone missing because of it. A useful test for whether the system is holding is this. At the end of each day this week, ask yourself honestly whether anything from that day exists somewhere other than the single capture location. If the honest answer is yes, even once, that's the specific moment worth examining at your next weekly audit. Not to assign blame, but to understand exactly what made routing it properly feel too costly in that particular moment, so the actual friction point gets addressed directly rather than simply repeating itself the following week. Layer 5 is the compounding weekly audit, and it's the layer that determines whether the first 4 layers hold for years or quietly dissolve within a single month, the way almost every ambitious personal system eventually does without this specific piece deliberately built into place from the start. None of the first 4 layers are naturally self-maintaining, no matter how well they work in the first few days after you build them. Attention residue management drifts the moment you get busy enough to skip the closure sentence a few times in a row, telling yourself you'll get back to it tomorrow, which quietly becomes never. Decision automation erodes the moment a few fixed defaults get abandoned under pressure during one particularly hectic week, and nobody consciously notices the reversal until months later, when the same decision fatigue has crept back in without an obvious cause. The systems over goals tracking gets forgotten the moment a demanding week arrives and attention snaps back toward staring anxiously at the distant goal instead of the process itself. Single point capture breaks the instant one genuinely urgent item gets scribbled somewhere entirely outside the system, because routing it properly felt, in that specific rushed moment, like it would take too long. The compounding weekly audit is a fixed, genuinely non-negotiable 15-minute review scheduled for the exact same time every single week that checks specifically for drift in each of the previous 4 layers individually, rather than reviewing your life in some vague, unfocused general sense the way most casual weekly reflections tend to operate. Is the task closure sentence from Layer 1 actually happening consistently throughout the week, or has it quietly stopped without you consciously noticing the gap? Are the fixed defaults from Layer 2 still genuinely in place, or have 2 out of the original 3 quietly reverted back to fresh daily decisions again, one small exception at a time? Is the system tracking from Layer 3 still actually running as designed, or has attention shifted back toward anxiously watching the distant goal instead of the process that's supposed to produce it? Has anything leaked outside the single capture location from Layer 4 during the past week, and if something has, specifically identifying why it happened, so the actual leak point gets addressed directly rather than simply noted and forgotten again? This audit is precisely what separates people who build these 5 layers into a genuinely permanent operating system running underneath their entire life, from people who run all 5 layers brilliantly and impressively for exactly 3 weeks, and then quietly, gradually revert to precisely where they started. The same way almost every ambitious personal system reliably reverts without a mechanism specifically designed to catch its own early decay, before that decay becomes total, requiring a complete and exhausting rebuild starting again from absolutely nothing. The 15 minutes themselves should be treated with the same non-negotiable seriousness as any of the other 4 layers, scheduled at a fixed time, ideally the same day and hour every single week, so that the audit itself never becomes one more thing competing against the ordinary chaos of a busy day for a spare moment that may or may not actually materialize. A missed audit isn't a small, harmless oversight. It's the exact mechanism by which the other 4 layers begin their slow, largely invisible decay, week after week, until the entire system has quietly reverted without anyone consciously deciding to abandon it at any single identifiable moment. Here's what a genuine 15-minute audit actually looks like in practice, broken into roughly equal segments. The first few minutes go to Layer 1, scanning back through the week and honestly asking whether the closure sentence happened consistently, or whether it quietly stopped somewhere around Wednesday when the week got busier than expected. The next few minutes go to Layer 2, checking whether the 3 fixed defaults from earlier are still genuinely in place, or whether one of them slipped back into a daily decision without you noticing exactly when that happened. The middle section covers Layer 3, counting how many days the chosen system actually ran this week, honestly, rather than rounding generously in your own favor, the way most private self-assessments tend to do. The next segment covers Layer 4, reviewing whether anything ended up outside the single capture location this week, and if so, identifying precisely what made routing it properly feel too costly in that specific moment. And the final minute or two is simply deciding, based on everything just reviewed, whether any of the 4 layers needs a small adjustment before the coming week starts. Not a redesign, just a small correction where drift was found. This structure matters because a vague, unstructured weekly reflection, the kind most people attempt when they do bother to reflect at all, tends to produce vague, unstructured conclusions like, "This week felt busy," or "I should probably do better," neither of which changes anything concrete going into the following week. The structured layer-by-layer audit instead produces specific, actionable findings. Layer 2's breakfast default held perfectly, but the message-checking default collapsed by Thursday. So that's the one thing worth deliberately reinforcing next week. That level of specificity is what actually compounds over months, turning 5 individually modest habits into a single, durable operating system that keeps improving itself through its own built-in feedback loop, rather than slowly eroding the way most personal systems do once the initial motivation that built them has naturally faded. Let me put the complete 5-layer system together, because dangerously organized isn't the product of any single layer in isolation, no matter how well that one layer is executed on its own. It's the compounding effect of all 5 running simultaneously, each one protecting against a specific kind of leak that none of the other 4 layers address at all, which is exactly why partial adoption of this system, running 2 or 3 layers while ignoring the rest, produces meaningfully weaker results than committing to all 5 together. Layer 1 closes attention residue with a 1-sentence task closure before every genuine switch, recovering cognitive capacity that would otherwise silently drain across an entire day without ever being traced to its actual source. Layer 2 automates recurring low-stakes decisions with fixed, pre-committed defaults, preserving decision-making capacity specifically for the choices later in the day that actually deserve it. Layer 3 tracks the repeatable system rather than the distant goal, sustaining genuine motivation through the long, invisible middle period where most ambitious efforts quietly die without any dramatic moment marking their death. Layer 4 routes everything through a single capture location with a genuine zero-exception rule, eliminating the background tracking cost of information scattered across multiple half-remembered places throughout your day. And Layer 5 audits all 4 of the previous layers every single week without fail, catching drift while it's still a small, easy correction rather than allowing it to silently compound into total system collapse, requiring a complete rebuild from nothing. None of these 5 layers require talent in any meaningful sense, and none of them require some innate personality trait that naturally organized people were simply fortunate enough to be born with, while everyone else missed out entirely. They require the same thing that real, published, peer-reviewed research keeps confirming, across completely different domains and completely different research groups, decade after decade, that human performance is far more a function of environment, structure, and deliberate mechanism than most people instinctively assume, and far less a function of raw willpower or momentary motivation than almost all popular self-improvement content still insists on selling, because willpower and motivation are easier to package into an inspiring video than an unglamorous, mechanical system that only needs to be explained clearly once and then simply followed. One more time on the K.M.A method, because the composure this entire 5-layer system depends on is exactly what it's built to protect. 5 minutes a day for mental control and inner calm. The QR code is on the screen right now, and the link is in the description. Every layer in this video assumes a baseline of internal quiet that most people's default mental state doesn't actually have without deliberate daily practice. And this is the piece that makes that baseline genuinely available rather than theoretical. Before you go, drop a comment with the layer 1 through 5 you're starting with this week. I read every comment, and I want to know which specific leak is costing people the most right now, because that pattern tells me exactly what to cover in more depth in future videos on this channel. And if you know someone who seems constantly busy but never quite gets ahead, someone who works hard and still ends every week feeling like they're treading water rather than moving forward, send them this video, because what they're missing usually isn't more effort, more hours, or more willpower. It's the 5 specific, identifiable leaks this entire system was built to close, one at a time, in a deliberate order that actually holds over months rather than collapsing within the first difficult week. Dangerously organized isn't a personality, and it was never something certain people simply have while everyone else doesn't. It's a mechanism, built from 5 separate, well-documented pieces that reinforce each other, and now you have all 5 parts of it laid out clearly enough to start building this week, starting with whichever layer is currently costing you the most, without you having fully realized it until today.